Greetings, welcome to Powered by Nyame. I'm your guide and host, Kwesi Kunadu. On this episode, this will be part one of a series of conversations about do you really think you know what African spirituality is and what it entails? And so in this initial episode, let's jump right into it. Many of us, especially on YouTube, have seen lots of videos, introduction to African spirituality, basic African spirituality for beginners, and so on and so forth. And the levels, of course, differ depending upon who's the presenter and what they're providing. I want to share with you in these series of conversations to disrupt what you might have assumed or think or believed or practiced in terms of what you think is and is not African spirituality. So, let's begin with cosmology. That is, ideas that Africans and other people have about the order of the universe, the cosmos, and how and what place the human beings have within that, particular order, right? And so, cosmogonies are the stories about cosmology. That is the sort of broader view, cosmic view, if you will, of these celestial matters, as well as what place and how human beings fit into that broader picture. And so if you think about many of the African creation stories that I'm about to share with you, I want to take away or pull away a few important themes to then talk about in this initial offering, African spiritualities in a way that you perhaps not have heard or seen or read before. So let's get into it. Let's start, for example, with this theme of diversity and ecology, that is where people live over generations and period of time. So diversity and ecologies, right? Ecology of diversities. Some may even call it human ecology, that is the interaction between ecology or environment and human beings. And so let's start with this. Where people live often determine or influences how and what they believe over a period of time. Let's take a few examples. So when we talk about African spirituality, singular, it doesn't exist. It can't exist because there's no singular cosmology or cosmogony or so-called worldview shared by African peoples, ancient and certainly in the contemporary moment. There is none. There has never been none. And I also want to demolish along the way the idea of purity. We'll get to that in a moment. So let's start, let's say, in Southern Africa. Southern Africa, there is more of an emphasis in terms of belief and practice, spirituality, that is more rooted in ancestry than it is in the spirits or spiritual forces and figures lodged or located in nature. For example, take a very well-known group that is known by way of TV, movies, and literature, the Zulu, right, or the Zulu people. So in the Zulu creation story, there is this figure, Nkulunkulu, that is created, right? He is this force and figure that then creates the earth and the elements of the earth, the seasons, therefore, and of course, human being. The Zulu considered this figure to be their first common ancestor, right? Notice that there is an emphasis or a central role given to this central figure as an ancestral figure, not a force of nature, not a force of the cosmos or the universe. Whereas, let's say, if you move it further, a little bit north into the Central African region or West Central African region among the Bakongo people, you'll find that there's also a attention paid to ancestry, but also to other forces. So among the Bakongo people, in terms of their cosmology, right, their view of the universe, the world, and human beings' place in both, in their creation story, there is this almighty supreme being figure, Nzambi Impungu. And Nzambi is, in fact, this creative force, right? This energy, this force that essentially there is a void in the universe, right? Now, it doesn't mean nothing is there. There's a void, which means that there's space, right? And space is something. So it's not the idea of nothing. So there's space, there's a void. And that void is essentially ignited by this force of fire. That fire becomes this particular force that ignites this void, this space, and essentially the heat then fills the void or fills the space with content, right, with material. And those materials include the earth, right, the animals, the winds, the rains, the water, and of course, human beings. And in that, there's a notion of muntu, the idea of the human being, of the person, that becomes this sort of figure or stand-in for the earliest of progenitors of human beings or the earliest ancestor, right? So you have here both, this creation, but the emphasis is less on particular kinds of spiritual force of nature, unless you consider the fire to be a force of nature, which it can be, but also there's an attention paid to ancestry. So that's Central Africa, West Central Africa, and these are broad stroke, but the idea is to give you something to hold onto as we move through this conversation, all right? Move further north, let's say into West Africa, in the forest. Let's say you come among the Yoruba people, whom the houses call Yoruba, and that's really how they get their name, Yoruba. And so among the Yoruba people, which is well known, you have this creative force, Odudua, but you also have Olodumare. And these creative figures, and of course you also have, Orumila. But Odudua is one of the central figures in terms of the creation, right? And Orumila is there as a witness to this creation, right? But then, much like the previous figures that I've mentioned, they sort of disappear after the acts or the moments of creation, right? And out of that creation, you have not only the earth, you have the seasons, the birds, the animals, the plant life, like you see in back of me, and you have human beings as well. But you also have forces of nature that are also created, referred to as orishas. And you can find parallels among the Fombe people or the Erefon, which they have Mawu, and out of that you get these laws, or you get these particular forces of nature that are created, right? And so among the Yoruba, and you find crossovers, in fact parallels, direct parallels, and there's cultural, historical reasons why, such as Shango or Ogun or Yemanja, and Obatala, and so on and so forth, right? You get these forces of nature that are more central than ancestral figures, right? Take a note. As you move further north out of the forest into the West African savannah, let's take the Dogon people, who are also well known. They live on the Bandegara cliffs, in these highland portions of what is now Mali. And, they have a notion in their creation story of this creative force referred to as Ama. Now, Ama shouldn't be confused with the Akan name, meaning a Saturday-born female child. This is a creative force. And Ama, essentially mates with the earth. In the first attempt, it doesn't go too well according to the sort of, standard account. Creates a jackal, and a jackal is associated with disorder, chaos, right? And for many who study ancient Egypt, will see that there's some parallels here between the notion of the jackal, the idea isfet, or chaos, disorder, right? Now, of course, you have to have disorder, like you have to have order. If you have order, you got to have disorder. We'll come back to these ideas in a moment. So, Ama, first attempt doesn't work at creation. There's a disorder that's created. But what is failure is not really failure. It's just simply you need to have disorder to recognize order, and vice versa. The second attempt produces, essentially these twins, right? And ultimately, out of this, creation, because Ama, usually spelled A-double-M-A, Ama has seeds, and out of these seeds, is the seed for the entire universe, right? The entire cosmos created, including the earth, and including human beings come out of this, right? And so in this particular cosmology, right, seeds are very important. In fact, seeds become crucial. So if you take, for example, the sort of cultural, kinfolks of the Dogon people, right, which we can class under the Mande umbrella. Mande is a cultural linguistic umbrella that is a large category for over 200 million people in West Africa, particularly in the Savannah region, right? And they include the Bamanakai, or the Bamana people who speak Bamanakai, and they include the people who are Malinke, right? They include a range of people who live in Mali, Burkina Faso, who live Guinea, and so on and so forth. So these Mande people, in their cosmology, also have this notion of the supreme being or supreme creative force referred to as Mangala. And out of this force, there are these seeds, right? Notice the commonality between these seeds. Amma seeds on a Dogon and seeds here. And out of these seeds, there is a reed that's created. And at the end of the reed, there is this figure, right? This figure that's created at the end of the reed. And this figure becomes the creator that creates essentially the earth, human beings, and all things that inhabit the world. And so if you think about these examples so far, what are some commonalities? A, geography or ecology oftentimes will determine or over-determine and influence the shape and even the content of the cosmologies or the belief systems that people have. And so, for example, among the same Mande people, the earth, termites, blacksmith, deeply important roles they have within the cosmology and therefore the cultural and spiritual practices of these people, indigenous practices of these people. Why? Because they're in the Savannah region where there's not much water. There's lots of large expanse of flat lands. Think the Lion King, right? That's the Savannah. And so, whereas in the forest people, there's a more emphasis what is too much water sometimes, lots of greenery, lots of vegetation, almost times too much. And so they, have a more emphasis where ancestors are there, but they are minor compared to the spiritual forces of nature, because nature is right up in their faces. Whereas in Savannah, you're dealing with the hot sun, open sun. There's no shade that the forest provides you in the Savannah, right? So you can see how ecology and environment begins to set. And you can also see, thinking about the Dogon, broadly speaking, the Mande people, the Bakongo people, West Central Africa, and the Zulu people, South Africa, among others, that you see the notion of African spirituality begins to fall apart. It's more African spiritualities, that is the plural. And within that plural, that's the diversity I'm referring to, that the idea of African spirituality is a misnomer, right? There is no purity, there's no unity, there are similarities, right? But there is no oneness across the entire continent. And it can't be, because African people have been home to and domesticated the various ecologies that form and have formed the African continent, over millions of years, right? And so in these African spiritualities, there's another layer when it comes to those Africans that were brought, last 500 years plus into the Americas. They brought with them African-based spiritualities, plural, right? That had these particular tenets or features with them. And in these features, what you find is that often we think that Africans, writ large, right, were converted to Christianity or versed from Christianity, whether Catholicism or Anglicanism or whatever form or denomination within the Christian constellation, right? They were, in fact, force converted, and they became, Christianized, and they lost, or they were compromised in terms of their African-based spiritualities, in terms of practice and belief. And many of us have come to believe that. And I want to shatter that here. So, for example, in my time in Brazil, which is northeast portion of Brazil in particular, but also I've been to other parts as well, is that what you find when you go to these terreiros, these sacred centers or so-called temples, you find, of course, there are three major categories. You have the Jeje, which are the Vodou or Fombe version from what is now Benin primarily. And you have the Yoruba, which is what is now from contemporary Nigeria. But certainly those contemporary borders don't really capture the movement and the settlement of those Yoruba peoples. You have that as a second category. And you have a third category when it comes to West Central Africa, right? These Congo-based or Bakongo-based spirituality. So these fall under the broad umbrella of what is called Candomblé, right? Under this umbrella, what you find when you go to a terreiro, you'll find any of these, whether Jeje or Yoruba or Bakongo, you find that there are not only iconographies and symbols of Shango or Ogun or Oya and so on and so forth, or Batla, or Yansa, but you also find that they have Catholic iconographies, right? And you also find some places I've seen, even other traditions, right? Indigenous peoples like the Tupi, which are indigenous people that are sadly called, Indians, right? The Tupi people, you'll find some of their iconography, some of their symbols, some of their, even the medicinal plants, as well as even attire. They will incorporate, they being the practitioners of Kanda, they'll incorporate within their spiritual cultural practice, right? Now, you might think, well, that's because of Christianization, enslavement, and so on and forth. But I want to give you another twist. I think not. What I'm saying, in other words, is that I've also been in Benin, that is the source for Voodoo in Haiti, New Orleans, and the Jeje tradition in Brazil. And I've been to all these places. And what you find is that in Benin, I was in Cotonou, the capital, and I went to this Voodoo, not voodoo, stuff in Hollywood, the Voodoo sacred place. I was invited there by some friends. We went there, and I was sitting up like in the upper deck area as they're performing their ritual and their ceremonies, and there was a picture, a big poster, really, of what we might call a white Jesus, right? And there were other iconographies. Once the ceremonies were over, went downstairs, they walked me through some of the, divinities, that is from nature, Satapa, Ogun, and so on and so forth, right? And I found other things that were there, ritual tools, implements that were there. And what you find is that both in Brazil and in Benin, you say, well, who's the sellout? Well, no one's a sellout. What Africans have realized over a long time, and this is very important understanding African spiritualities, is that these Africans, given their interactions with the world writ large, through trade, through other kinds of exchanges, they realize that there is power, keyword power, among the Akan people, right? They refer to power as Tumi. And there is power in the symbols and icons that belong to another tradition, right? So, for example, among these same Akan people, you will find that many Akan practitioners, right, of Akan spirituality, and I'm putting on the rabbit ears intentionally, they will use talismans that are made by Muslims, but not only Muslims, they actually incorporate passages from the Quran in these talismans that are used, and they use on these so-called fugu or batakari, which is the top attire that's usually worn by Northerners, but you find it more widely. And they have protective and other kinds of capacities that they're used, right? And so, is it the fact that these Akan people are compromised, or that they realize that there's some power rooted in the Islamic tradition that they can then put to use and enhance and grow their own powers? And that's really what I've seen, is that white Jesus in the sacred temple, Voodoo temple in Benin, the capital of Cotonou, they were incorporating an icon, a symbol from a tradition that has power and resonance, right, global resonance. And by incorporating it within their practice, they enhance and maximize their own power. In other words, they're adding to, they're growing it. And I've also seen throughout West Africa, whether it's in Burkina Faso or in Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, or in Benin proper. And I've been to many of these sacred sites, been to the markets where you find a lot of these ritual sculptures, tools, and paraphernalia, where you find, for example, Buddhist statues. You'll find, Indian statues, right? And people incorporate within tradition. And therefore, what really is African spirituality? That's a floating question to you, right? If these things have been incorporated, in fact, you may think, well, these are things that are usually incorporation that came by way of enslavement, that came by way of force. Well, take, for example, Great Zimbabwe, right? Or so-called Mutapa, which is in Southeast Africa. In the grave, in the funeral and funerary rituals and burials, you find pottery and other kinds of tools that came from Ming Dynasty China, right? That have been incorporated. And this is certainly, before the transatlantic era, right? And you even find, for example, in West Africa, you find like brass pans from Turkey, Islamic Turkey, what is now Turkey, formerly, Istanbul, part of the Ottoman Empire, 13th century, right? long before transatlantic slaving, that people are using within their ritual practice among the Akan people in the 13th century, right? These brass vessels that come from Egypt, that come from the Ottoman Empire, based in what is now Istanbul, Turkey, right? That are incorporated within a spiritual cultural practice, right? And so slavery can't be the explainer for these phenomena. And what I'm suggesting as another way to think about them is that simply, and this is true for the world in terms of world history, is that people incorporate practices that they see around them that has something of value and power that they can add to and bolster their own. This is the story of Islam. Islam comes in the 7th century, right? And it takes what? A lot of already existing Christian precepts, practices. It takes from the Arab people who were non-Muslim, obviously before Islam, and it takes from other cultures as well, right? That's why the Kaaba, this big volcanic stone, is a centerpiece, among the pilgrimage for all Muslims, right? That's a pre-Islamic, tradition. Christianity the same, right? Eating the blood and body of Christ as a ritual offering, right? That came from so-called pagan religions that were existent, before what the Romans referred to as the Jesus movement, right? And so all traditions, religions do this, right? There's no, mistake. It's not a matter of selling out, a matter of compromise. Is that folks recognize value and power, right? That they can then incorporate and add to their own. And lastly, I'll say this, and then we'll pick up next time on part 2 of this series, is that when you look at these examples and these ideas that I'm sharing with you, perspective, if you will, right? Think about them based upon what you know, what you practice, what you believe, and then let's have a conversation in the question and comment section below. Until next time, stay well.